How does a lonely pastor's son in Switzerland, a boy born into a world of rigid dogma and unsettling psychic phenomena, grow up to map the hidden landscape of the human mind? How does this solitary child carving secret totems in his attic transform into the 20th century's great explorer of the soul, a man who would dive deeper than any other into the myths, dreams, and madness that bubble beneath the surface of civilized life? This is the central paradox of Carl Jung. His entire life was a battle to reconcile two opposing forces: the empirical, scientific rationalism of his era and the profound, mystical, and often terrifying reality of his own inner world. He would not just study the unseen psyche, he would become its most courageous and, for a time, its most lost cartographer. Before we descend into that profound and fascinating inner world, if you find this exploration of the human mind and its hidden architects compelling, please consider supporting our channel. Take a moment to hit the like button, as it truly helps us reach more people. Be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new journey into history's most complex figures. And finally, if you know someone else who would appreciate this story, share this video. Your support is what makes these deep dives possible. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in Keswil, Switzerland, into a world of spiritual conflict. His childhood was not just quiet, it was profoundly isolated, deeply and permanently marked by the emotional crosscurrents of his family. His father, Paul Jung, was a country pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, but he was a man tormented by a struggling faith, a man who, in Jung's eyes, performed the rituals of his religion with hollow devotion, unable to answer his son's searching questions about God. This paternal crisis of faith was contrasted by the psychic instability of his mother, Emily Pricework, a woman who came from a family of spiritualists, and who Jung described as having two personalities: a stable, conventional daytime self and a strange nocturnal self who communed with spirits, a personality that would lead to her emotional breakdowns and hospitalizations. A solitary child, alienated from the simplistic dogma of his father and unsettled by the psychic volatility of his mother, Jung found refuge in the one place he could control: his rich, complex inner world. This was not the simple daydreaming of a lonely boy, it was a structured, ritualistic engagement with his own imagination. He famously carved a tiny, 2-inch-long mannequin from a wooden ruler, gave it a painted stone for a companion, and hid it in a pencil case in the attic of his family home. He would bring this secret figure scrolls written in a secret language of his own invention. This was not a game, it was his first, unconscious attempt at what he would later understand as a dialogue with the soul, a sacred, private ritual that gave his life the meaning his external world lacked. This early life a potent, unstable mixture of vivid, terrifying dreams. Like his childhood vision of a subterranean phallic god, his mother's family's seances and spiritualist practices, and the profound religious doubt he inherited from his father's crisis laid the immovable foundation for his lifelong fascination with the unseen psyche. He was a boy caught between worlds, the scientific, rational 19th century, and a much older, darker, more magical world of visions and spirits. He couldn't dismiss either, and he would spend the rest of his life building a bridge between them, a bridge he would ultimately call analytical psychology. He started his academic journey by studying corpses, not souls. His initial passion at university was for anatomy, biology, and paleontology, the study of an objective, physical, and ancient past. But a profound shift was coming. What could possibly make a young man, poised for a respectable career in medicine or biology, switch to the deeply unrespectable, low-status, and poorly understood field of psychiatry? At the turn of the century, alienists were seen as little more than asylum custodians. But for Jung, this marginalized field offered the one tantalizing possibility of uniting his two warring halves, his scientific mind and his mystical soul. Jung chose to study medicine at the University of Basel, a path that seemed to lead him further into the world of hard science. But a textbook he read at the end of his studies, a work by Richard von Krafft-Ebing on psychiatry, struck him like a bolt of lightning. He described it as an epiphany, a moment of profound revelation. He realized that psychiatry was the one field, the only empirical discipline, that dealt directly with the objective realities of the soul. the very phenomena he had known since childhood. It was a career that would allow him to be a scientist of the very things his father's theology could no underscore longer explain, and his mother's spiritualism embraced without understanding. In 1900, at the age of 25, he took a job that would define his early career, securing a position as an assistant physician at the Berghilsli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich. This was not just any asylum, it was a world-renowned, progressive institution under the directorship of the great Eugen Bleuler, the man who would famously coin the term schizophrenia, a condition Bleuler himself saw in Jung's mother. The Berghilsli was a living laboratory of the most profound and fractured states of the human mind, and under Bleuler, it was a place of intense scientific research, not just containment. It was here that Jung would begin his first great empirical work. Here, immersed in the living material of psychosis, Jung developed and refined the word association test. This was not merely a parlor game, it was a scalpel for the psyche. He would read a list of 100 words to a patient and measure their response time, their breathing, and their galvanic skin response. He noticed that delayed responses, strange answers, or physiological, emotional reactions to certain stimulus words like mother, water, or money were not random. They pointed to a patient's hidden, emotionally charged psychic wounds, which he named complexes. He was, for the first time, creating an experimental map of a person's unconscious, proving its existence and influence in a laboratory setting. When Carl Jung first met Sigmund Freud, it was a collision of two universes. They reportedly talked for 13 hours straight, a marathon of mutual intellectual discovery. Jung was the ambitious young researcher with experimental proof of unconscious processes. Freud was the revolutionary patriarch who had already drawn the first map. The bond was immediate, passionate, and quasi-familial. So why did this intense bond, this fated father-son relationship, inevitably have to break? The very intensity of their connection and the irreconcilable differences at the heart of their worldviews made a schism not just possible, but a tragic necessity. In 1907, Jung, already famous for his word association studies, traveled to Vienna to finally meet the man whose work, the interpretation of dreams, he had studied with fascination and skepticism. The intellectual connection was immediate and electric. Freud, 19 years his senior, was captivated by Jung's brilliance, his energy, and his position at the prestigious Berghilsli. Almost immediately Freud saw in Jung the one thing he desperately needed, a successor and heir who could carry the fragile torch of psychoanalysis out of the narrow confines of his Jewish circle in Vienna and into the wider Gentile academic world. Freud was not subtle about his intentions. He openly called Jung his crown prince and his adopted eldest son. This was not just affection. It was a deeply political and strategic move. Freud was haunted by the fear that psychoanalysis would be dismissed by the anti-Semitic world as a Jewish science. He needed Jung, a Swiss, a pastor's son, a man of international scientific standing, to legitimize the movement and ensure its future. This placed an enormous, and ultimately unbearable, pressure on Jung, casting him in a role he had not chosen and would eventually be forced to reject. It was one word that tore the fathers of modern psychology apart: libido. This single, Latin term became the battleground for their entire worldview. What did this word mean to Jung that Freud could not, or would not, accept? For Freud, his entire theoretical edifice rested on this one concept, and to question it was to question everything. For Jung, to accept Freud's definition was to accept an intellectual and spiritual prison, and it was a confinement that his own experience and his own ambition could not tolerate. The core disagreement was profound, total, and irreconcilable. For Freud, libido was almost exclusively sexual energy. It was the primal drive, the engine of the human psyche. All neurosis, in his view, stemmed from the repression of the sexual drive. All civilization, all art, all religion, was merely sublimation, the rechanneling of this raw sexual energy into more socially acceptable forms. This felt far too narrow and reductionist for Jung. Looking at his patients and into his own soul, he saw a world of myth, spirituality, and creative yearning that could not, in his view, be reduced to a mere byproduct of repressed sexuality. Jung proposed a broader, more flexible, and more mystical concept. He kept the word libido but radically redefined it. He saw libido as a generalized psychic energy in neutral, creative life force, similar to Henry Bergson's élan vital. This psychic energy, this will to live, was the fundamental power of the psyche, and it could be channeled in countless directions. It could fuel art, it could power the religious instinct, it could drive a quest for knowledge, it could build a civilization, or it could manifest as a desire for personal growth, not just as a sexual impulse. It was a vision of humanity driven by a thirst for meaning, not just by a need to procreate. How do you tell your mentor, the father figure you have loved, the most famous and iconoclastic mind in the world, that his entire life's work is fundamentally wrong, or at least dangerously incomplete? You do not do it in a private letter. You do not do it in a quiet debate. You do it publicly, in print, in a way that can never be taken back. You publish a book. This was an act of intellectual patricide, a declaration of independence that would change the course of psychology forever. In 1912, Jung published Psychology of the Unconscious, later retitled Symbols of Transformation. The book was a ticking time bomb. It began as an analysis of the fantasies of a young American woman, Miss Frank Miller, but Jung quickly used her case as a launchpad to explore the vast, interconnected world of global mythology and religion. He linked her modern, personal visions to ancient myths from cultures she could have never known. His explosive conclusion: these powerful, symbolic images were not just disguised, repressed personal sexual fantasies from her childhood, as Freud's theory would have demanded. They were something else, something older, something impersonal and universal. The book was a declaration of intellectual independence, a gauntlet thrown at Freud's feet. It directly challenged the Oedipus complex and the primacy of sexual libido, the very pillars of Freud's temple. It made their split inevitable and brutally public. Freud felt betrayed by his son, and Jung felt suffocated by his father's dogma. Their final, painful, and bitter letters ceased in 1913, accusing each other of neurosis and misunderstanding. Their historic, complex, and transformative relationship was over. After breaking with Freud, Jung didn't just have a professional crisis, he fell into a terrifying, bottomless void. He had lost his mentor, his intellectual father, his closest friend, and the entire theoretical framework that had structured his career for the past 6 years. He was professionally isolated, adrift, and in his late 30s. This void was the collapse of his conscious, rational world, leaving him utterly exposed and face-to-face with the very thing he studied, the raw, chaotic, and terrifying power of the unconscious. What did he find waiting for him in the dark? From 1913, and coinciding with the outbreak of the First World War, a cataclysm he saw as a collective psychosis mirroring his own, Jung entered a period of profound personal crisis. He called it a creative illness, or, more famously, his confrontation with the unconscious. He had recurring, apocalyptic visions of Europe being drowned in a sea of blood. He feared he was becoming schizophrenic, succumbing to the same madness he had studied for years at the Bergholzli. But the scientist in him, though terrified, held on. He made a courageous decision. He would not run from the madness. He would descend into it, deliberately, and document it as an explorer. He resigned his lectureship at the University of Zurich and began this terrifying journey inward, a process he would later call active imagination. He would sit in his study, close his eyes, and deliberately descend into his visions as if they were a real place. He spoke with imaginary, autonomous figures who emerged from his mind: Philemon, a wise old man with a long beard, and kingfisher wings, who became his inner guru, and Salome, a blind, seductive woman. He did not dismiss them as mere hallucinations. He treated them as real, independent psychic entities, fragments of his own soul, and he conversed with them, demanding to know what they wanted and what they had to teach him. As he descended into his own personal abyss, he began to notice something astonishing. The characters and stories he encountered were strangely familiar. Why do the same figures, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the great mother, appear in myths, legends, and fairy tales from cultures that never met? Why were these same figures now appearing in his 20th century, scientific mind? He had already glimpsed the answer in his 1912 book, but now he was living the proof. These weren't just stories, they were fundamental, pre-existing structures of the human mind itself. From this terrifying, creative descent, Jung discovered the universal patterns in the psyche. He called them archetypes, primordial, inherited images and patterns that are the psychic residue of our ancestors repeated. Typical human experiences. An archetype, he explained, is not a specific image or memory, but rather an innate propensity or potential to form certain images. It is like a dry riverbed, a pre-existing channel in the psyche, which our personal life experience the water flows into and takes shape from. They are the deposits of the psychic experience of humanity, shared by all. He identified and named the key figures in this inner pantheon, the major archetypes that every human must encounter on the journey to wholeness. He identified the persona, the social mask we wear for the world, the shadow, our dark side, the person we do not wish to be, the anima, the inner, feminine soul image in a man, and the animus, the inner, masculine soul image in a woman, and finally, the self, the archetype of wholeness, the total personality, the God image within, which is the ultimate goal of life, distinct from the ego, our small, conscious sense of self. What if you were born with memories that are not your own? What if the human mind was not a blank slate, but came preloaded with the collected wisdom, trauma, and symbols of every human who ever lived? This was Jung's great, revolutionary leap. He proposed a psychic internet, an invisible, inherited database connecting every human being, past and present. This concept would become the great dividing line, the one that separated him definitively from Freud and from all of 19th century materialism. This was his most revolutionary and controversial idea. He posited that below the personal unconscious, which was Freud's primary focus as psychic basement, where you store your own repressed memories, traumas, and forbidden wishes, there lay a much deeper, vaster, and older layer. He called this the collective unconscious. It is not something we develop. It is something we are born with. It is the shared psychic inheritance of all humanity, a second psychic system of a collective, universal and impersonal nature. It is a shared, inherited layer of psychic structure, common to all humanity. This is where the archetypes live. This theory provided a stunning, unified explanation for a vast range of human experience. It is why the myths of the hero from ancient Greece, medieval Europe, and indigenous America are fundamentally the same. It is why a modern, civilized person in Zurich can have a dream filled with the same symbols found in an ancient Egyptian tomb. The cultures never met, but they all dipped into the same deep, collective well of human experience. For nearly a century, his most important work, the very source code of his creative illness, was kept hidden from the world, locked away in a Swiss bank vault. What was Carl Jung? A man who built his career on revealing the hidden, so afraid to show the world. He feared for his scientific reputation. The document was too personal, too raw, too mad. It was the confession of his journey into the abyss, and he believed the world and his academic colleagues were not ready for it. He feared it would destroy his credibility as a man of science. The Red Book, or Liber Novus, the New Book, was his secret, personal journal. Though journal is a wholly inadequate word, he worked on it obsessively from 1914 to 1930, meticulously documenting his confrontation with the unconscious. It is a massive, leather-bound volume, which he illustrated himself with intricate, beautiful, and terrifying paintings in the style of a medieval illuminated manuscript, and which he handwrote in elaborate, formal calligraphy. It was his personal, sacred text, the record of his Nicaea, his dialogue with the dead and the gods within him. It is filled with his darkest, most apocalyptic visions, his transcripts of his dialogues with inner figures like Philemon and Salome, and his terrifying, vivid paintings of the archetypes as they revealed themselves to him. It contains mandalas, serpents, giants, gods, and monsters, all bursting forth from his mind. It is not a book about the unconscious. It is a direct, unedited transmission from it. It is the unconscious made visible, a terrifying and beautiful artifact of a mind on the brink, and its journey back to wholeness. He called the experience documented in the Red Book the prima materia for his life's work. This is a crucial alchemical term, the first matter, the raw, undifferentiated, chaotic lead from which the gold of wisdom is eventually made. The Red Book was his chaos. His entire subsequent library of collected works is academic, scientific books on archetypes, individuation, and psychological types was his lifelong effort to analyze, categorize, and translate that raw, terrifying source material into a respectable, usable, and safe form. It was not published until 2009, long after his death, when his family finally agreed the world was ready to see it. Are you energized by being around people, or are you drained by them? Does your energy naturally flow outward to the world, or does it flow inward to your own thoughts? The answer, which now seems like a common sense part of our vocabulary, defines your basic personality, thanks to a concept Jung created. This was the most practical and immediate application of his theories, a way of mapping the conscious personality, and it's the one contribution almost everyone, even those who know nothing of archetypes, is familiar with. In 1921, having emerged from his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung published one of his most influential works, Psychological Types. In it, he proposed two fundamental attitudes to life, or to main directions for the flow of libido psychic energy. He called them extroversion, where energy and attention flow outward, to the external world of people, objects, and actions, and introversion, where energy and attention flow inward to the internal world of ideas, concepts, and reflections. Crucially, he insisted neither was better or worse. They were simply two different, valid ways of being in the world. He then combined these two main attitudes with what he identified as the four primary functions of consciousness, thinking which analyzes with logic, and feeling which assesses with values, which he called the rational or judging functions, and he added sensation, which perceives the world via the five senses focusing on what is, and intuition, which perceives the world via the sixth sense focusing on patterns, possibilities, and what could be, which he called the irrational or perceiving functions. This created a complex, 8-part map of personality, as each function could be either introverted or extroverted. This foundational work, which was far more complex and nuanced than its later iterations, would be adapted by two American women, Isabel Myers and her mother, Catherine Briggs. They had read the English translation of Psychological Types and were inspired to create a practical, accessible tool based on its principles. Their goal was to help people, particularly women entering the workforce during World War II, understand themselves and find work that was a good fit. The result was the famous Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, arguably the most popular personality test in the world, a direct, though simplified, descendant of Jung's deep psychological map. Everyone has a dark side, a part of themselves they hide from the world and, more importantly, from themselves. This is a universal human truth, but where other systems of morality or therapy sought to repress, punish, or destroy this shadow, Jung's therapy was radically different. He argued that the goal was not to destroy this shadow, but to turn and face it, to acknowledge it, and finally, to embrace it. For Jung, this was the beginning of all true wisdom. The shadow is the archetype of everything we repress, deny, or disown about ourselves. It is the person we do not wish to be. It becomes the psychic container for our fears, our weaknesses, our unacceptable impulses, our greed, our rage, our envy, and our socially taboo desires. We build this shadow in childhood, as we are taught what is good and bad. But Jung noted it also contains gold. It can be the source of our hidden strengths, our creativity, our assertiveness, and our unlived life, parts of us we repressed simply because our family or society didn't value them. We almost never see our own shadow directly. Instead, we engage in projection. We often project our shadow onto other people, hating them with an irrational, emotional intensity for the very faults we possess but refuse to see in ourselves. That co-worker you despise for being lazy, that politician you loathe for being arrogant, that other group you see as evil. Jung would gently suggest that the intensity of your hatred is a clue. It is often a disowned, unrecognized part of your own shadow, which you are now fighting out there instead of in here. Jung taught that wholeness, the goal of a meaningful life, is impossible without integrating the shadow. This is not an invitation to become your shadow, to act on every dark impulse. It is a courageous, humble, and painful process of accepting it, of withdrawing your projections, and acknowledging, yes, that darkness, that weakness, that capacity for evil, that is also a part of me. This is the first and most difficult step to self-knowledge. It is what makes you a whole person, not just a good one, and it brings the shadow's immense energy under your conscious control. What is the meaning of life? For Carl Jung, this was not a peripheral philosophical question, it was the central question of psychology. He was deeply dissatisfied with a psychiatry like Freud's that aimed merely to cure neurosis or, as Freud put it, to transform hysterical misery into common unhappiness. Jung believed psychology's true purpose was not just to heal the sick, but to guide the healthy on a quest for meaning. His answer to this quest was a difficult, lifelong, and sacred process: individuation. Individuation was Jung's ultimate goal, the telos of his entire system. It is the lifelong psychic process of integrating all the conscious and unconscious parts of the self, the ego, the shadow, the anima, animus, and the archetypes to become a fully realized, differentiated, and whole human being. It is the journey of becoming an individual, which literally means undivided. It is the process, as he famously said, of becoming who you truly are, rather than the person your parents, your culture, or your own unexamined defenses told you to be. It is a journey with a clear, though difficult, path. It involves, first, the courageous confrontation with the shadow, owning one's personal darkness. It then involves the integration of the anima. For a man, or animus for a woman, the soul image that connects the ego to the deep, unconscious, often found through projection onto a romantic partner. And finally, it involves connecting with and centering the personality around the self, the archetype of unity, wholeness, and the God image within. Jung observed that as his patients underwent this process, they would spontaneously begin to dream of, or be compelled to draw, mandalas, ancient circular symbols of totality and psychic balance, to prove that his theories of archetypes and the collective unconscious were universal, and not just the fantasies of a Swiss doctor or his European patients. Jung had to leave his office. He was a scientist, and he needed empirical, cross-cultural data. If the collective unconscious was truly collective, then its fingerprint should be visible everywhere, in the myths, rituals, and dreams of all humanity. He had to get out of Europe and find it in plain sight. Jung became an explorer, a psychological anthropologist. He traveled to North Africa to study tribal myths. Most transformatively, he traveled to New Mexico in 1925 to speak with the Pueblo Indians. There he had a profound conversation with a chief named Aquiambiano Mountain Lake, who told him that white people were mad because they think with their heads, not with their hearts, and had lost their connection to the earth and their myths. This conversation was a stunning confirmation for Jung of the Western world's dangerous psychic imbalance and its overvaluation of logos, rational thought at the expense of eros, connection, and feeling. He journeyed to India, immersing himself in the ancient, sophisticated psychological systems of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. In these Eastern traditions, he did not find primitive superstitions, but rather highly developed maps of the inner world that had been refined for millennia. He saw in their concepts of Atman and Brahman, the individual and universal soul, a clear parallel to his own ideas of the ego and the self. In their pantheons of gods and goddesses, like the creative and destructive Shiva and Kali, he saw clear expressions of the archetypes in each culture. He found the same fundamental patterns, just wearing different cultural costumes. As Nazism began its terrifying rise in Europe, Jung saw it not as a mere political or economic movement, but as a terrifying mass psychosis. He was one of the first thinkers to apply a psychological lens to this collective madness. He had warned of this coming storm in the Red Book, seeing visions of a European blonde beast Wotan, reawakening. His analysis, diagnosing an entire nation as being possessed by an archetype, was deeply controversial, blending psychology with prophecy. Jung diagnosed the German people as having unleashed their collective shadow, which had been repressed and humiliated after World War I. He argued that the archetype of Wotan, the ancient Germanic god of storm, fury, and ecstatic madness, had possessed the German psyche. Adolf Hitler, he said, was not a strong leader, but a weak one, a man with no personality of his own, who had become a hollow loudspeaker for the German collective unconscious, the German people. In this mass psychosis, then projected their collective shadow onto the Jewish people, who became the scapegoat for all the darkness they refused to see in themselves. His role during this period remains the most complex and debated part of his legacy. He was rightly and heavily criticized for briefly heading a general medical society for psychotherapy that had been restructured and Nazified in 1933. His defenders, and Jung himself, argued that he took the post to protect psychotherapy as a discipline and to safeguard his Jewish colleagues, and indeed, he personally helped many Jewish refugees escape to England and America. His critics, however, argue he was naive at best and at worst, a willing participant whose own writings contain troubling strains of anti-Semitism. The truth, like Jung's own shadow, is complex, uncomfortable, and far from simple. Carl Gustav Jung died in 1961 at his home in Küsnacht, Switzerland, overlooking the lake that had been his lifelong companion. But if you have ever seriously analyzed a dream, taken a personality test, or found yourself captivated by the hero's journey in a film like Star Wars, you live in the world he built. His direct influence on psychology may be less than Freud's, but his cultural influence is arguably far greater. Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which George Lucas used as a blueprint, is a work of pure, applied Jungian theory. His ideas, once dismissed as hopelessly mystical and unscientific, are now everywhere, woven into the fabric of our common language. The concepts of introvert, extrovert, archetype, the shadow, and the collective unconscious are used by millions who may have never even heard his name. The entire New Age and self-help movement, with its focus on finding yourself and spiritual growth, is a direct, if simplified, descendant of his work. In the end, Freud gave psychology its basement and its first floor, rooting the mind and the body in sex and in aggression. But Carl Jung gave psychology its cathedral. He reintroduced the concepts of spirituality, myth, meaning, and the soul into the study of the mind. He provided a map not just for the sick, but for anyone seeking a deeper, more meaningful life. A map for the profound, lifelong, and sacred journey of exploring one's own inner world.